Okay, hello guys, this is Graham and I'm just recording my notes to go with chapter 12 of the book, which we're covering in week 11. This chapter is all about leading change. The chapter in the book has a fairly comprehensive summary of what most organisations have become accustomed to understand by the management of change. It's the GCSE version, I suppose. If you were doing an MA in anything change related, then I sincerely hope that you would cover a far wider range of definitions and considerations. So here's one or two of the issues that I think you need to be aware of. There was an incredibly influential book, Future Shock, which was published in 1970, with sequels in 1980 and 1990 by two American labour experts, Alvin and Heidi Toffler. They followed a model which was more commonly associated with social anthropologists, in that they'd met as graduate students. They then went to work in industry as blue-collar workers for nearly a decade, became labour activists, and then re-entered the mainstream as journalists in 1959. While Alvin had the job titles and the prestigious employers, Heidi was actually the primary researcher, though she wasn't always given credit for this. They became known as futurists, and they were perhaps the first of the breed of that occupation. They were remarkably good at sound bites that shook people's thinking, and it was the Tofflers who coined the phrase, "change is the only constant." If change is so endemic, then there are no steady states. All we can hope to do would be to manage people's responses to the latest state of affairs, knowing that this state too will change. In which case, managing their responses to the latest state would also be pointless. It's far better to equip people to cope with change for themselves so that it's expected and they know how to manage their own emotional responses to it. Here are just a few of the sound bites from Alvin and Heidi Toffler from the 1970s. Another dimension to this is to ask whether people actually experience change within organisations. If the average worker is engaged for only 4 to 5 years in one organisation, how many change initiatives will they experience? Quite probably 1 or 2 at the most, and the second of these will quite likely coincide with their exit from the organisation. One of the pieces of work that I've asked you to do is to look back over the last 3 to 5 years and see how many change initiatives you've encountered in that time. There are 3 phrases that are frequently used by people as if they were interchangeable. They actually have specific and quite different meanings. If someone doesn't know the difference, then I personally would be worried about letting them loose in any kind of organisational change initiative. Management of change is a step-by-step process known as a stage model, where the steps are predefined rather like a recipe. They're usually linear, they're sequential, and they're unidirectional. It assumes that everything goes right all along the way. The CIPD illustrate this in figure 12.1 with a 5-step model: analysis, planning, communication, implementation, and institutionalization. Of course, complex things like organisations and the people within them rarely respond according to plan. And if change is a constant, then the place we are aiming for is going to be shifting too. So why would we want to institutionalise a state that has become largely redundant by then? As the CIPD also say, all on page 322, despite representations to the contrary common in the popular management literature, there is no foolproof recipe for managing organisational change. They also say increasing recognition of the limitations of stage models of change, and then quote Reisner from 2011 as a source of reference for you. And finally they say, to succeed at managing organisational change, managers and change agents need to focus their attention more on reading the context of change and respecting the organisation's history and culture. This requires a complex set of skills, including analysis of business processes, self-awareness, and people skills. I guess it's up to you to decide when you're being offered a model of change, whether the people that have developed it have actually got that self-awareness and people skills developed. The second phrase that gets misused or abused or not even considered is theory of change, which is a far more sophisticated way of creating a plan of how to achieve a different state of being for an organisational community. Working backwards from where do we want to be and what are all the necessary precursors for that to happen, if it's adequately resourced and it's given sufficient time, then it stands a far higher chance of success. Of course, we may not have the time to wait for that to happen. The third phrase is change management. This has got to be the most misapplied management term ever. It's a technical term developed by and legitimately used by information technology specialists, IT specialists. It involves making changes to working computer systems, primarily the software but also actually the hardware, and it necessitates keeping 3 copies of the system. One is working, it's live, it's doing whatever it has always done. The second is a clone of the first, and if the first goes wrong for any reason, then the inputs and outputs can be connected to the second, and the users will hopefully not notice that anything has changed. The third copy begins as a clone of the first, but it's the one that the techies then tinker with until they're confident that it will work better than the first. Of course, there are all kinds of other safeguards, particularly involving testing, that will be used before version 3 is allowed to replace version 1. But my concern yet again is that if you hear people using those 3 phrases and they don't actually understand that what they are talking about is management of change or the theory of change, then clearly there's something not quite right. And if they refer to management of change, a stage model, then they certainly ought to realise that most people these days have reservations about how effective those are. So finally, I've mentioned before the misuse of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's grieving model to understand people's responses to change. The diagram 12.2 in the CIPD textbook bears a striking resemblance to a simplified version of Kubler-Ross's model. Bear in mind that she herself expressed alarm and regret at the way in which her model had been misapplied in this manner, and that the apparently sequential nature of it was a complete mistake. There are simply 5 different responses that most people experience, a few of which most people will experience when they are exposed to change. The typical responses that people exhibit to change in their work can include, and not all of them and not in any particular order, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. In my experience, most people these days actually just experience 3 in the work context. The first one is bafflement. It's usually accompanied by the words, "But why?" The second would be that they simply couldn't really care less, which prompts the response, "Fine, all right then, what do you want me to do?" And then the third one, which is probably our delight if we're introducing change, and again will come from some people, is, "Phew, great, let's get on with it." They're excited at the possibility. So that's a quick recap over about 9 minutes of what I think are some of the more important aspects of change and the leadership of change. So there's only really one thing to do now. Let's get on with it.